Hello everyone, and welcome to Let's Make a Gaming Company, Episode 2. We're going to look at the kind of trash mail you get because you've registered a business and now they have your information and they're going to send stuff to you. Second, we're going to look at what I've spent most of my time the last few weeks doing, and that is trying to create the game design document. So let's talk about trash mail. What sort of mail do you receive once you've started a company? New Jersey documents. Certified certification of formation request form asking me to pay roughly $90 for them to print out with a nice little seal on it that I have a registered certified certification. No, we're not going to do this. This particular document is to, as it states here, obtain elective certified hard copies of my certificate. I don't need a hard copy. I've got a PDF of it. What else do you get? Business loan offers. So this is probably the second or third one I've gotten so far. Not just business loans, but also credit cards and bank accounts. Something that I will eventually have to consider, but at the moment, no, not yet. One, I don't quite have the funds to just throw usually around $5,000 into an account to do absolutely nothing. Something to check out in the future. What else is going on? Well, the most important part is creating the game design document. And I have sort of 3 different games that I can begin to work on. So this is the template game design document that I've put together. It's based on a few different things. One is that within the certification courses I was taking for Unity, one of them contains both a game design document and a technical document. And I used both of them to come up with the general template. Now, each of these sections isn't required. In fact, each of the 3 games that I'm kind of tinkering with at the moment don't need all these sections. Some of them omit entire areas. Other ones require far more detail. So the beginning is the game overview. We're just going to summarize things like the title of our game. Of course, that's a working title. Nothing that I'm going to show you is finalized at this point. What platforms we're targeting. I'm typically going to be targeting the PC platform because that's what I happen to have in my house. If I had access to a Mac or had the funds to buy one, then I would look at also targeting those ones. Android or mobile is a pretty saturated market, and the games that I plan on making, I don't feel like they're going to compete well. I'm kind of sticking away from that. VR is also another platform that I'm considering, but honestly, it's a very small niche market, and unless I have something really good to offer in that area, I'm just going to limit the kind of sales I can get. Genre. Is it a roguelike? Is it a horror game? Is it some sort of action, adventure, platformer? That's what you would end up putting there. Age range is an important one. Some of my games are 13 plus I'm targeting. Other ones are a little younger, maybe 10 or even 9 years old. If I'm going for more of a psychological horror mind mess kind of thing, obviously my age range is going to be a bit older. Target audience, who are you going for? That also kind of ties into age range, but really what sort of people, what kind of demographic, right? If we're talking about people as if they were categories. And then finally, a description. Now the description is meant to be sort of a elevator pitch level description where in a few sentences you kind of explain the overall game. I consider this description more about what you would read on the back of a box, back when you bought things in a store, and it would describe sort of the overall feel of the game and what's going on from a non-technical standpoint. The selling points one is interesting. What is going to make people buy your game? What is interesting about it? Do you have interesting mechanics? Is it unique? Is it story driven, where the person's own choices become part of their adventure or their journey? Or is it just, mind numbing? Platforms and requirements gets a little bit more complicated. We're getting more specific. Now, most of the things that I'm targeting are going to be, I don't know, maybe you can play the game on hardware that's 4 years old. Now, CPU and GPU, at the moment, I'm not exactly sure. These are answers that I'm going to get as the game develops and I see how complicated things are and I try to optimize things and make them work. So for the template, I've also provided little, hints at what you're supposed to write. So for a synopsis, a short paragraph that's going to describe the story, objective, that the player of the game would understand. This is not meant to be technical, but it's also not sort of the general description on the back of the box, giving you a little bit more information about what you're doing, what your goal is, and where you're going inside the game. Now, game objectives are the overall goal of the game, where the synopsis can kind of explain the whole entirety within the context of the story. The game objectives don't necessarily have anything to do with the story, right? You could have a wonderful storyline, right? Like an old game, a button masher, where buttons pop up on the screen, kind of like a lot of the games that used to be on Sega CD, where you are watching a movie. But the objectives are press the button at the appropriate time to make the right action occur. If you miss, you lose. Game rules, so the structure of the gameplay, any limitations, the combat systems, the rounds, how it's actually going to function. This one's complicated. Some of my games, I'm probably going to figure out the rules as I go along. This is a living document. Some people might be able to sit down and completely write this thing inside and out and have it all up here in their head. That is not how I work. I need to also prototype and work with it at the same time and adjust things, because many times what up here is fun, it's not when you actually create it. So the game structure, showing how you're going to progress through the games. Is it open world, sandbox, levels? Are there areas that are cut off until later points? If you're playing Grand Theft Auto, you had different parts of the landscape, right? A bridge that would be down until you achieve a certain mission or something. How do you move between different worlds or locations? Gameplay, some of these are really important to nail down from an input perspective. Things are probably going to be keyboard and mouse. You kind of need to have an idea of what actions are going to be taken by the character. We can move. Doesn't matter how we move. It could be a controller or a keyboard. That's not important. What is important is that we have movement that's forward, backwards, strafing, left or right. Next up is camera, and that comes down to, in many ways, the perspective of the game. Is it first person, third person? Is it second person, where it's kind of like attached to some part of you instead? What are the camera controls? Do you get to move the camera? Is the camera automated? Is it isometric? Is it locked? Can you zoom in? Can you zoom out? Can you focus on an object, tumble around it? And then, of course, the HUD. If these are VR games, usually the HUD becomes very minimalistic. We don't want that crap all over the screen, or it's a three-dimensional HUD within the game environment. Are we going to have health? Are we going to have magic? Are we going to have different user interfaces for inventory? Player. This section is one that, based upon the game, may be omitted. There might not be the concept of a player. If you're playing Tetris, you don't really consider yourself, there is no version of yourself in the game that has really a storyline, right? Or Bejeweled or any of those sorts of games. You don't necessarily need this section, but if you do, you can describe who the player is in the context of the story, what they're there to do, maybe their limitations. Visual representation comes down to what are they going to look like in the game. So then there are the metrics for the player. Do they have experience points? Do they have health points? Are their shields regenerative? Or is it, one shot, one kill? What actions do they have? How do they move around the scene and at what speed? Can they jump? Can they double jump? Can they triple jump? Can they fly? States is also another thing that really depends kind of like on animation. Items, power-ups, and inventory, it pretty much explains exactly what it is. Then we come up with the characters. So we'll have usually a lineup. This is a graphic that shows relative size, shape, and so forth through the other characters. Then you'll have a list of all the different non-player characters. Here we have name, description, any special mechanics. Why is that NPC in the game? Next up, we have environments. What is the overall setting for the world? Are we in a post-apocalyptic space society? Are we under the sea in a small little coral reef? But then once you figure out the overall setting of everything, then we can start specifying the locations. And this part, the locations, might tie directly into progression and the levels, right? Name, description, intent. Why do we have this level? Did we just want, a giant fire castle because it looks cool, or is that actually part of the plot line? And then finally, behaviors. What is special about this spot? Now, these other sections I am not filling in at this time on any of my documents because it's just too early. We have audio, music, and sound effects, with my focus more on the visuals and the gameplay side. The music and the SFX are probably going to be kind of added after I get the rest of that all down. Now, one of the most important things, and honestly one that I'm not really doing a great job of, is coming up with the minimum viable product. The list of features that you need to ship this thing. Really, that is what I should be focused on most. Finally, wish list. I kind of see that you need to have a lot of the rest of the document done before you get to the wish list, because you need to take all of that stuff you've written and sort of say, all right, what is actually achievable? I see the wish list as something that maybe will grow during development as certain features just become too difficult for me to manage or implement myself. They will be pushed into this wish list and further down on the stack. So that's the general template. So let's talk a little bit about the 3 different games. I'm not going to show everything. okay? Because it's way too early to do that. But we're just gonna maybe look at this first page. This is a silly game called Poop Shoot. It's a PC game, it's a puzzle genre. It's 13 plus, 13 because, you know, the name Poop Shoot is a little gross and it's gonna have some kind of gross stuff in it. The entire premise is you need to eat to live, but the waste has to go someplace. So you control the input of food into your mouth, so you're actually sitting on a toilet or, you know, wherever you're defecating, and you are going to have a choice of accepting what comes to your left or accepting what comes to your right, but you have to accept something. And hopefully it's food. Well, that's part of the game actually, is what is coming your way. And you have to change which way you're looking, but you also have to change where your butt is, because when you poop, you need to make sure you don't stack it all the way up so it comes out of the water. If it comes out of the water and you overflow the toilet, you lose. At least that's the current lose condition. Very simple, silly game, and those are kind of in the selling points. It's a silly premise, it's going to have potty humor, it'll attract teens, adults, and probably even little kids who are like, oh my god, it's got poop, and I'm eating like weird stuff, what is this? Probably even younger kids through YouTube, right? Because the young kids are going to want to play the things they're not supposed to play, or that are a little bit weird or scary or gross. The gameplay is expected to be simple, but it's going to be challenging as you progress, because it doesn't just start that way. It is going to get more and more difficult as the environment around you changes and other things happen. You know, you can add all sorts of weird things like, oh, maybe there's a bidet, or maybe you're at an outhouse instead and there are flies buzzing around you, all kinds of little ideas like that. It's a simple game to make, and I should be able to complete it relatively easily. And that's important right now, is to get a win, to actually get something all the way from beginning to end, deploy it, and then start to learn about all the bad stuff that happens afterwards, right? Bugs, issues, fixes, updates, all that is stuff that I haven't dealt with before. And having a simple game like this might be a good way for me to start getting into the more serious or complicated games in the future. Now let's look at another game. And some of you might actually be excited about this if you follow my Glee Cakes channel. So let's take a look at the Buoyancy Slip House. This is the Five Nights at Freddy's style game that I had been working on for a few years. Buoyancy Slip House, that's the name of the family that's running the business. Right now, the platform is VR or HTC Vive, although I am on the fence on this. I might not do it for VR, but it's going to be a first-person horror puzzle game. Targeted at audience of 13 plus. Jump scare, maybe. I'm hoping to have like some better horror in it than just jump scares. You are the newly hired mechanic with some small familial relation to the owner at Buoyancy Slip House, where you maintain the various machines and devices during the night shift. You must accomplish missions each night to stay alive. Very simple premise. So selling points. This game is going to target large audience out there of FNAF, Bendy, Poppy Playtime fans with a slightly darker and more mind-bending experience. Aimed at a slightly older fan base, this game will feature an immersive story, an unreliable player, and an unreliable narrator to constantly keep you guessing what is real or not. The choices you make in the game will directly impact the visuals, which can include your perception of characters, places, and events. Taking your medication will also impact the visuals around you. That's less of a selling point. It's not a bulleted list, but it gives you some ideas of what the game is going for. So for this one, for platform requirements, these are pretty much just taken from what an HTC Vive requires, or any VR system at this point. So dual-core hyper-threading GeForce 1070 or above, 8 gigs of RAM, USB 3.0 ports. Having all that there is just good because I know what I'm targeting. What I'm doing now is I'm going through and trying to figure out the story. And it has changed quite a bit from what we talked about before. We now have a master and a mistress of Buoyancy Slip. These are the older parents who are in charge of the business. We have 4 children of 5. One of them has died. What I kind of decided was I was having a really hard time figuring out the whole world. So I just said, let's just pull a Star Wars. And instead of starting with episode 1 and figuring everything out, let's just start like on episode 4 and assume that there will be other games in this series, and the other games are going to explore these other characters. So it doesn't really matter. But here we're coming up with the cast. The cast of the primary antagonist in this game is going to be Luna Buoyancy Slip. She is the youngest child by quite a bit. She was an oops baby. You know, she wasn't really intended. She just kind of happened, but she's been reminded of this her entire life. She runs the oldest of the locations because, you know, everyone else has moved on to better places, and she's always looked at as sort of the least favorite, so she gets the crappy older location. But she has to deal with many things like repairs, and that's why she is hiring you specifically. She is always constantly worried about proving herself to her family. Now, the animatronics list is the same list that I had in the game before, and really I don't like any of these, and I'm probably going to be changing these up for this particular location. The story is getting bigger and bigger. There's an entire background, an introduction, explains who you are and what's going on, and then I've started to now put in the Vive controls and figuring out what thing is going to control what action, both the HTC Vive as well as the Valve Index controllers. But I haven't gotten much further, and that's because I'm trying to take all of that project now and put it into this format to give me some structure, because I know this has been something that's been going on for a long time, and I would like to finish it as well. All right, so there's one other title that I'm putting together, and that one is the most serious of all the games, probably the more difficult of all the games to put together. So this game is called Generational Starship, and the target audience is 10 plus. It's going to be a roguelike sim adventure style game, but it's pretty much targeting people who enjoy games with that can be very long, but also feature a lot of personalized choices. The description: the future is in space. However, faster than light technology does not exist. In fact, it will never exist. It is simply impossible in this world. There's no bending, there's no space-time, there's no warp fields, there's no nothing. Therefore, to connect to many stars and all of the humans that are spread now out through all the places, and to gather resources and so forth, generational starships are used, where the crew not only sign their own life to a contract to operate the ship and get it to where it needs to go, but they literally sign off on the next generation and the next generation and potentially dozens of generations off into the future to come. And it's going to be up to you to manage your generational starship as people die and live and have kids, or maybe catastrophes happen. You are going to be creating this ship of your own custom family that's going to go off on different contracts and missions. Selling point for something like this is obviously replayability and a huge number of choices. Elements are going to be procedurally generated as you move through all these different locations. Random events will happen. Maybe you get a radiation sickness or something and it destroys some of your genome, and then you lose some of the progress that you had, and you have to, maybe you'll buy systems to help counteract that, or maybe you'll need to, stop by on a planet and try to find someone to have a family with, so that you can continue on your journey. So I envision it just being a lot of events and wacky things going on, and more importantly is you're going to be creating your own family, and in doing so you can kind of choose the genetic pathways that you want your family to be like. Kind of like in Dune, how you've got the different houses, right? And they have been, they weren't necessarily doing it, but what the Bene, I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but the Bene Gesserit or whatever, were sort of making people go a certain way. So, you could make your people really smart, or maybe really strong, or maybe a combination of all these things. I don't know, but I plan on having all of that in there. But that's a look at the 3 different games and the design documents that I've created for each of them. None of them are finished yet. So what I'm probably going to do now is start prototyping with a lot of the concepts that I have here. Hopefully I'll start to have parts of the Generational Starship game put together. I'm also going to open up the old Five Nights at Freddy's project and start converting assets over to the pipeline I'm going to be using, which is probably for a VR-esque game going to be the HDRP pipeline. But I'm still very new at that, and I've got to figure out how that works, because it's far more complicated than the standard pipeline from the past. And that's it for now. I will try to put out another video sometime next week explaining the progress I've made. Hopefully I'll have some code put together and some beginning examples, or at least parts of projects for us to see. See you all next time. So long and goodbye.